They seated me in row 15 at my daughter's wedding, 15 rows back, where I could barely see the altar through the sea of guests, many of whom I didn't even recognize. This, after I had written checks totaling $87,000 to give Eleanor the day of her dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The day of my daughter Eleanor's wedding arrived with perfect June weather. I woke at dawn and spent an hour getting ready, carefully applying my makeup and styling my silver hair. The pale blue dress I'd chosen, after weeks of shopping, hung pristinely on my closet door. I'd lost 15 pounds for this day, wanting to look my best in the photos that would capture this milestone. As I fastened my late mother's pearl necklace, I couldn't help but smile at my reflection. Despite everything, I was genuinely happy for Eleanor. I arrived at Willow Creek Estate 2 hours early, just as I'd promised. The venue was breathtaking. Manicured gardens overlooking the valley, a restored Victorian mansion with a grand ballroom, and a separate glass pavilion where the ceremony would take place. I should know every detail. I'd visited it 7 times during the planning process. Each time, the event coordinator had addressed all questions to me since I was the one signing the checks. "Mrs. Harrington, you're early," called Veronica, the wedding planner, waving a clipboard as she hurried across the lawn. "We've just finished setting up the ceremony space. Would you like to see it before the other guests arrive?" I nodded, following her through the garden pathway. My sensible heels sank slightly into the manicured grass as we walked. "The florist outdid herself," Veronica continued. "The orchid arrangements you upgraded to look stunning against the backdrop of the valley. The pavilion took my breath away. Rows of white chairs adorned with lavender and cream ribbons faced an arch decorated with cascading white orchids and greenery. The morning sunlight streamed through the glass walls, creating a cathedral-like glow. This was exactly what Eleanor had described in our first planning meeting, before her future mother-in-law, Patricia, had begun attending those meetings, and before my daughter had started avoiding my calls. "It's perfect," I whispered, running my fingers along the petal of an orchid. The final bill for just the flowers had been nearly $12,000. "Your seating is right here, of course," Veronica said, pointing to the front row. "Mother of the bride." I smiled gratefully. At least some traditions were being respected. After inspecting the reception ballroom, with its 20 round tables, crystal chandeliers, and hand-calligraphed place cards, I retreated to the bridal suite to wait for Eleanor. The room was filled with champagne bottles, makeup cases, and garment bags belonging to the bridal party. I sat quietly in the corner armchair, clutching the vintage handkerchief I'd brought as Eleanor's something old. When the door burst open, it wasn't Eleanor who entered, but Patricia Blackwood, mother of the groom, flanked by her daughter Iris and 2 of Eleanor's bridesmaids. They stopped short when they saw me. "Margaret, we weren't expecting you yet," Patricia said, her smile tightening at the corners. She was impeccably dressed in a designer outfit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. What she didn't know was that I'd taken money from my retirement fund to ensure this day was everything Eleanor wanted. "I thought I'd come early to help Eleanor get ready," I explained. Patricia exchanged glances with Iris. "Eleanor is having her hair done in the second suite. She mentioned wanting some quiet time before the ceremony." She set down her bags, expertly avoiding eye contact. "We've got everything handled here. Bridesmaid duties and all that." One of Eleanor's friends, Zoe, I believed, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. "Oh. Well, I brought her something old for the tradition." I held up the handkerchief that had been in our family for 3 generations. "My mother carried it at her wedding, and I carried it at mine." Patricia smiled indulgently. "That's thoughtful. Margaret, but Eleanor already has her something old. Darren's grandmother's sapphire hairpin, a Blackwood family heirloom." "I see." I clutched the handkerchief tighter. "Well, I'll just go say hello to her anyway. She's quite stressed, Iris. Cut in. The makeup artist said no interruptions. Maybe check back closer to the ceremony time? I nodded, feeling suddenly out of place in a wedding I had spent the last year organizing and financing. When my husband Thomas died 3 years ago, I'd set aside a significant portion of his life insurance specifically for Eleanor's future wedding. She was our only child, and Thomas had always told me to make sure her special day was everything she dreamed of. As I left the suite, I heard Patricia say, "Honestly, she's hovering already. Did you finalize the seating chart adjustment I suggested?" 2 hours later, guests were being ushered to their seats for the ceremony. I stood near the garden entrance, waiting for someone to escort me to my place in the front row. The mother of the bride traditionally sits in the front row, opposite the groom's parents. I had attended enough weddings to know this, but when the usher approached, a young cousin of Darren's I'd never met, he consulted his list and gestured toward the back of the pavilion. "Mrs. Harrington? You're in row 15 on the aisle." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "I'm the mother of the bride." He checked his list again, uncomfortable. "Yes, ma'am. It says right here, Margaret Harrington, row 15, seat 1. I looked past him to the nearly filled pavilion. From my position, I could see Patricia and her husband Richard already seated prominently in the front row, on what should have been my side. "There must be a mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "The mother of the bride sits in the front?" The young man shifted awkwardly. "I'm just following the chart Mrs. Blackwood finalized this morning. If you prefer, I can double-check with her, but they're about to start the processional." People were staring. The string quartet had begun playing the prelude music. This was not the time to create a scene at my only daughter's wedding. "That won't be necessary," I said quietly, allowing him to lead me to the back row. As I took my seat, I felt a hollowness open up in my chest. From this distance, I would barely be able to see Eleanor's face as she said her vows. After a year of tastings, venue visits, and writing checks totaling just over $87,000, I had somehow become an afterthought at my own daughter's wedding. The orchids I had paid for, the champagne, the 5-course dinner, the string quartet, all of it arranged with love and now experienced from 15 rows back. A woman I didn't recognize leaned over from the row in front of me. "Aren't you Eleanor's mother?" she whispered. I nodded, blinking back tears. "That's odd," she murmured, looking confused. "I would have expected you to be up front." So would I thought. So would I. The music shifted, signaling the start of the processional. As the bridesmaids began their walk down the aisle, I made a decision. This wasn't about tradition or propriety anymore. This was about standing up for myself in a way Thomas would have insisted upon if he were still here. I would sit quietly through the ceremony out of love for Eleanor. But afterward, some truths would need to be spoken. I had spent a lifetime being accommodating, stepping aside, making room for others. But not today. Not after this. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They seated me in row 15 at my daughter's wedding. After I'd paid $87,000 to give Eleanor her dream day, I found myself sitting behind strangers, straining to see the ceremony through a sea of heads and elaborate fascinators. This was the final indignity in a pattern that had been building for months ever since the Blackwoods entered our lives. Eleanor hadn't always been ashamed of me. Growing up in our modest 3-bedroom home in Meadowbrook, she'd been a loving child who proudly introduced me to her teachers and friends. I raised her alone after Thomas died of a heart attack when she was only 14. We became a team, the two of us against the world. I worked 2 jobs, bookkeeping at the local hardware store during the day and online customer service in the evenings, to ensure she could attend college without crushing debt. When she graduated summa cum laude from State University, no, One cheered louder than I did. I remember her running to hug me after the ceremony, whispering, "We did it, Mom. This is for both of us." In that moment, all the missed sleep and budget meals had been worth it. The shift happened gradually after she landed her job at Meridian Consulting. Suddenly, my daughter was moving in social circles I'd never been part of. Her new friends had vacation homes and family connections. I watched her vocabulary change, her wardrobe upgrade, even her accent softened some of its regional edges. I told myself this was what I'd worked for, giving her opportunities I never had. Then came Darren Blackwood, with his Ivy League education and family money that stretched back generations. The first time Eleanor brought him to my home for dinner, I spent days preparing. I borrowed a set of matching dishware from my neighbor Judith, bought wine that cost more than my usual grocery budget, and practiced making beef Wellington until I could do it in my sleep. "Mom, this is Darren," Eleanor said when they arrived, her hand clasped tightly in his. He was handsome in that polished way that spoke of good nutrition and expensive haircuts. His smile seemed genuine as he handed me a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my electric bill. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, Mrs. Harrington," he said. "Eleanor speaks of you constantly." Dinner went well enough. I asked about his work in finance. He politely inquired about my bookkeeping job. Eleanor beamed between us, relief evident in her posture. It wasn't until they were leaving that I caught the first glimpse of what was to come. "You've done remarkably well raising Eleanor on your own," Darren said, his tone just a shade too surprised to be truly complimentary. "My mother always says it takes exceptional strength to manage without the advantages of a complete family unit." The engagement came 6 months later. Eleanor called me, excitement bubbling through the phone. "He proposed at the Symphony Gala, with his grandmother's ring," she gushed. "The Blackwoods are insisting on hosting an engagement party at their country club next month." "That's wonderful, honey," I said, already mentally calculating how many extra hours I'd need to work to contribute meaningfully to the wedding expenses. "I'd like to help with the costs. Your father's insurance—" "Oh, Mom, you don't need to worry about that," she interrupted. "Darren's parents have already said they'll handle everything. They're thinking about Willow Creek Estate for the venue." I swallowed hard. "But traditionally, the bride's family—" "That's so outdated, Mom. Besides, the Blackwoods are used to hosting these kinds of events. Patricia, that's Darren's mother, she's on the board of 3 different charities. They do galas all the time." Despite her assurances, I insisted on meeting with Patricia and Richard to discuss wedding plans. That first meeting at their sprawling Tudor-style home in Lakeside Heights set the tone for everything that followed. "We've taken the liberty of creating a preliminary guest list," Patricia said, sliding a spreadsheet across her marble kitchen island. I scanned the names, over 250 people, most of whom I'd never heard of. My own list of family and friends would barely fill 3 tables. "This is very generous," I said carefully, "but I'd like to contribute financially. I've been saving for Eleanor's wedding since her father died." Richard and Patricia exchanged a glance I couldn't quite interpret. "Well, that's very sweet, Margaret," Patricia said. "Perhaps you could handle something specific, like the flowers or the bridesmaids' luncheon." "Actually, I'd like to pay for the venue and catering," I said firmly. "I've looked into Willow Creek, and I can manage it." The silence that followed was palpable. Richard cleared his throat. "Margaret, you're aware that Willow Creek's wedding packages start at around $50,000, and that's before customizations." "I'm aware," I said, maintaining eye contact despite my racing heart. What I didn't tell them was that this would consume nearly all of Thomas's insurance money, the safety net I'd clung to since becoming a widow. In the end, they relented, though not without Patricia insisting that she would coordinate with the vendors to ensure everything met their standards. What followed was a series of subtle exclusions, planning meetings scheduled when I was working and couldn't attend, decisions made and simply reported to me after the fact, and Eleanor's increasing tendency to call Patricia first with any wedding. Questions. I noticed Eleanor beginning to mirror Patricia's mannerisms and preferences. My daughter, who had once loved the wildflower arrangements I put together from our garden, now spoke enthusiastically about imported peonies and orchid centerpieces. The simple, elegant wedding she had once described transformed into an elaborate society event. When the invitations arrived, I noticed they listed only Mr. and Mrs. Richard Blackwood as hosts. When I called Eleanor about the omission, her response cut deep. "Mom, it was just simpler this way, since they're handling most of the coordination. But I'm paying for the venue, the food, the flowers. I know, and I appreciate it, but Patricia said traditionally the invitations only list who's hosting the actual event. It doesn't mean you're not important." But each small exclusion did exactly that. Reinforced that I wasn't important enough, polished enough, or connected enough to stand beside the Blackwoods. The seating consultation I'd been promised never materialized. The mother-daughter bridal shopping trip became a group excursion with Patricia and her friends from the country club. My suggestions for including Thomas's favorite song as a tribute were gently but firmly dismissed as disrupting the musical theme. A week before the wedding, I visited Eleanor at her apartment, bringing photo albums and her childhood teddy bear Butterscotch that she had always said would be her something old someday. "I thought we could look through these together," I said, setting the albums on her coffee table. "Remember how you always said you wanted Butterscotch to be part of your wedding day?" Eleanor glanced at the worn teddy bear and something flickered across her face. Recognition, nostalgia, and then something else. Something that looked uncomfortably like embarrassment. "That's sweet, Mom, but the wedding aesthetic is pretty specific. Patricia hired a stylist to ensure everything coordinates perfectly." She didn't meet my eyes as she added, "We've already arranged all the traditional elements. Darren's grandmother's sapphire hairpin will be my something blue and old combined." I clutched Butterscotch a little tighter. "I see. What about these photos? I thought maybe we could display a few at the reception. There's that beautiful one of you and your father at the lake." "The display tables are already planned with Blackwood family heirlooms and professional portraits," she said quickly. "Besides, those old photos don't really fit with the elegant vibe we're going for." I left the albums but took Butterscotch home with me. That night, sitting alone in my living room, I finally allowed myself to cry. The daughter I had raised, who had once proudly shown off the Halloween costumes I'd sewn by hand and the birthday cakes I'd stayed up all night decorating, was now embarrassed by our life together. She was trading our shared history for the prestige of becoming a Blackwood. Yet when the final invoices came due, it was my signature on the checks. Invoice after invoice arrived, each more extravagant than the last. I paid them all without complaint, telling myself this was my gift to her, my last act as the mother who had always put her needs first. And my reward was row 15, seat 1. Behind the extended Blackwood family, behind Darren's business associates, behind even the neighbors from their exclusive subdivision. Just far enough away that no one would notice the mother of the bride wearing her best department store dress among all those designer labels. As I watched my daughter glide down the aisle, looking like a princess in a gown I had only seen in photos texted to me after it was purchased, I made a decision. The pattern of erasure that had defined the past year would end today, not with anger or a scene, but with truth. Eleanor needed to remember who she was and where she came from. More importantly, she needed to remember who had always been there, holding her hand through every storm, while the Blackwoods were nowhere to be seen. The moment everything changed came during the wedding reception. I'd made it through the ceremony with quiet dignity, straining to see my only child exchange vows from my distant seat. I'd smiled for the handful of photos where the photographer remembered to include me, standing awkwardly at the edge of family, groupings where the Blackwoods commanded center stage. I'd even managed to deliver my mother of the bride speech, hastily added to the program after my brother David made a pointed comment to the wedding planner about its absence. I was seated at table 19, far from the head table where Eleanor and Darren sat flanked by his parents. My table mates were distant cousins of Richard Blackwood and an elderly great-aunt who was hard of hearing. The centerpiece, an elaborate tower of orchids that I had paid for, partially blocked my view of the head table. "You must be so proud," shouted Great-Aunt Mildred, leaning toward me. "Which side are you from again?" "I'm Eleanor's mother," I repeated for the third time that evening. "The mother of the bride?" Her roomy eyes widened in surprise. "Why on earth aren't you at the head table?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound self-pitying. Instead, I smiled tightly and turned my attention to the perfectly cooked salmon I couldn't taste. The band began playing, signaling the start of the dancing portion of the evening. Richard led Eleanor onto the floor for the father-daughter dance, a tradition that had been modified without consulting me. I watched as my daughter, radiant in her gown, was twirled around by a man she had known for barely a year. Then came the moment that broke the spell. Patricia Blackwood, champagne flute in hand, clinked her glass for attention. The room quieted as she stood, resplendent in her designer gown. "Richard and I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate our Darren finding his perfect match," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. "When we first met Eleanor, we knew she was special. It's been our absolute pleasure to welcome her into our family and to put together this beautiful celebration of their love." My fingers tightened around my water glass. "Put together?" I glanced around, seeing nodding heads and warm smiles directed at Patricia. She continued, detailing her many contributions, the exquisite taste reflected in the decor, how she'd persuaded the renowned chef to create a custom menu, her personal selection of the wine being served. "Most of all," she said, tears glistening in her eyes, "we're grateful for the opportunity to give these two young people the perfect start to their life together. There's nothing more important to us than family, and we spare no expense when it comes to those we love." Applause erupted around the room. I sat frozen, my mind racing through every check I'd written, every withdrawal from Thomas's insurance fund, every overtime shift I'd picked up to make this day possible. Not once in Patricia's speech was there any acknowledgement of my contribution, financial or otherwise. I looked toward Eleanor, expecting to see her discomfort, waiting for her to stand and correct this misrepresentation. Instead, I saw her beaming, up at Patricia, nodding along as if everything being said was true. In that moment, something crystallized within me. This wasn't just about a seating arrangement or social awkwardness. This was about erasing me, not just from the wedding, but from Eleanor's life story. The band started up again, and guests returned to their conversations. Patricia made her way through the crowd, accepting compliments and congratulations as if she were the bride herself. When she approached my table to greet Mildred, she barely glanced in my direction. "Margaret, are you enjoying yourself?" she asked distractedly, her eyes already scanning the room for more important guests. Something inside me snapped. Not in a dramatic, table-flipping way, but in the quiet, profound way that fundamental truths sometimes arrive. I had spent my entire life accommodating others, making myself smaller to make room for them. I had taught Eleanor to be kind and gracious, never imagining she would use those lessons to allow others to diminish her mother. "Actually, Patricia," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I was just thinking about what a beautiful wedding this is. The venue, the flowers, the food. It's exactly what Eleanor deserved." "Yes, it came together beautifully," she agreed, clearly ready to move on. "It certainly did," I continued, rising from my seat to meet her eye to eye. "All $87,000 worth." Patricia's perfectly maintained smile faltered. "I'm sorry?" $87,000, I repeated. "That's what I've paid for this wedding. The venue deposit, the catering, the flowers, the band, the photographer, the cake, all of it. Every check signed by me, Margaret Harrington. The color drained from Patricia's face. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Eleanor had spotted our conversation and was making her way toward us, alarm evident on her face. "There must be some mistake," Patricia said, lowering her voice. "Richard and I have been handling all the arrangements." "Arranging, yes. Paying? No." I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. "I have copies of all the receipts if you'd like to see them. The venue alone was $35,000. Eleanor arrived at Patricia's side, her expression a mixture of confusion and growing horror. "Mom? What's going on?" "I'm just clarifying something with Patricia," I said calmly. "She seems to be under the impression that the Blackwoods paid for this wedding." "Mrs. Harrington is confused," Patricia said quickly, placing a hand on Eleanor's arm. "This isn't the time or place. I'm not confused about the $12,000 for flowers, or the $8,500 for the band, or the $15,000 for catering," I said, loud enough that the nearby tables had gone quiet. "What I am confused about is why I'm seated at table 19 when I paid for every centerpiece in this room." Eleanor's face had gone pale. "Mom, please." "What I don't understand," I continued, my voice breaking slightly despite my best efforts, "is why you've let these people convince you that your mother, who raised you alone, who worked 2 jobs to put you through college, who has loved you every day of your life, doesn't deserve to sit near you on your wedding day." The silence had spread beyond our immediate vicinity. David had appeared at my side, his hand supportive on my shoulder. Even Mildred seemed to have heard perfectly, her mouth hanging slightly open. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately," Richard suggested, suddenly materializing beside his wife. "No," I said firmly. "I don't think we should. I've been private and accommodating for months while watching my daughter's wedding turn into a Blackwood family production. I've listened to Patricia take credit for things I paid for. I've watched Eleanor slowly erase our life together to better fit into yours. And I've done it all without complaint because I wanted her to be happy." I turned to face my daughter directly. "But I realized something today, Eleanor. If your happiness depends on pretending to be someone you're not, on being ashamed of where you came from, then it isn't really happiness at all." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I've never been ashamed of you," she whispered. "Then why am I sitting behind people you've never met?" I asked softly. "Why did you let Patricia give a speech taking credit for everything I provided? Why did you tell me there wasn't room for a photo of your father?" The questions hung in the air between us. For the first time in months, I felt as though my daughter was really seeing me, not as an embarrassing reminder of her less polished past, but as the woman who had given everything to secure her future. Darren had joined our growing circle, his expression concerned. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between Eleanor and his parents. "Apparently there's been some confusion about the financial arrangements for the wedding," Richard said stiffly. "No confusion," I corrected. "Your parents have been coordinating everything, but I've been paying for it, which would have been fine. It was my gift to Eleanor, except they've also been taking credit and treating me like an afterthought." Darren turned to Eleanor, his brow furrowed. "You told me your mom couldn't afford to contribute much and that my parents were covering everything." The shock on my face must have been apparent because Eleanor immediately reached for my hand. "No, that's not. I never said—" She turned to her new husband. "I told you Mom was handling the venue and some other things, and your parents were helping with the rest." "That's not how it was presented to us," Patricia interjected. "You specifically said Margaret had limited means and would be contributing what she could, which we understood to be some nominal amount." "So none of you actually talked to each other about who was paying for what?" David asked incredulously. "You just made assumptions?" The embarrassment on all their faces answered the question. I realized then that the problem wasn't just the Blackwoods' snobbery or Eleanor's social climbing. It was that no one had been honest. Eleanor had allowed each side to believe what was most convenient, that the Blackwoods were generous patrons, and that I was content with a background role. I think, I said, finding strength I didn't know I had, that it's time for some honesty. I loved you enough, Eleanor, to give you the wedding of your dreams, even when those dreams seemed to have no place for me in them. I loved you enough to stand aside while you created a new identity that better suited your future in-laws, but I love you too much to let you become someone who forgets where she came from. The truth of my words hung in the air between us, a moment of perfect clarity amidst the orchids and champagne and designer dresses. I saw recognition dawn in Eleanor's eyes, not just of what I had sacrificed financially, but of what she had been sacrificing spiritually. The authenticity and history that had shaped her into the woman Darren had fallen in love with. And in that moment, surrounded by the opulence I had funded but not chosen, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. After the confrontation at the reception, there was a painful stretch of silence. Guests pretended to be absorbed in their meals while stealing glances at our group. The band leader, sensing the tension, quickly started a lively number that drew some people to the dance floor, creating a buffer of normality around our family crisis. Eleanor was the first to move. To my surprise, she gently took my hand and led me away from the others, toward a small antechamber off the main ballroom. Darren followed a few steps behind, his expression troubled. Once inside, Eleanor closed the door, muffling the music and chatter from the reception. "Mom," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought—" She paused, seeming to search for words that wouldn't sound hollow. "I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" I echoed, unable to keep the disbelief from my voice. "From what? Being treated with respect at my only daughter's wedding?" Eleanor sank into one of the velvet armchairs, careful not to wrinkle her gown. "From feeling like you had to compete with the Blackwoods. From feeling obligated to spend money you shouldn't have to spend." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading for understanding. Every time the budget increased, or Patricia suggested something more extravagant, I worried about the pressure it put on you. I thought by letting them believe they were handling most expenses, it would be easier for everyone. "So you lied." "To both sides," Darren said quietly, leaning against the wall. "It wasn't an accusation, merely a statement of fact." Eleanor nodded miserably. "I didn't start out meaning to lie. It just evolved. Patricia would make a suggestion, and rather than saying, 'I need to check if my mom can afford that,' I'd say, 'Let me think about it.' Then I'd ask Mom about it later, knowing she'd never refuse me anything. And instead of telling your mother that my parents were taking over most of the planning despite her financial contribution, you let her believe she was just being included less than expected," Darren added, the pieces falling into place for him too. I took the chair opposite Eleanor, suddenly feeling every one of my 63 years. "Why row 15? I asked, the hurt still fresh. "Of all the things, Eleanor, why seat me where I could barely see you say your vows?" My daughter's face crumpled. "That wasn't me. I gave Patricia the seating chart basics and asked her to finalize. I never checked the final version. I just assumed—" She trailed off, the excuse sounding weak even to her own ears. "You assumed she would treat your mother with the respect she deserves," I finished for her. "But how could she know to do that when you've spent months allowing her to act as if I was an afterthought?" Darren pushed himself off the wall and came to sit on the arm of Eleanor's chair. "I should have paid more attention," he admitted. "I noticed things sometimes, comments my mother made, the way certain decisions excluded you, but I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in mother-daughter dynamics." A knock at the door interrupted us. Richard entered, his face a careful mask of civility. Patricia was notably absent. "The guests are wondering where the bride and groom have gone," he said. "The cake cutting is scheduled for 15 minutes from now." "We're dealing with something important, Dad," Darren replied. Richard's expression softened slightly as he glanced between the three of us. I understand that. And for what it's worth, Patricia and I had no idea about the financial arrangements. We were under the impression that Margaret's contribution was minimal. He turned to me directly. Regardless, you should have been seated appropriately. That was an oversight on our part. An oversight. As if my relegation to the back of the room had been a simple clerical error, and not the culmination of months of systematic diminishment. "Dad, can you give us a few more minutes?" Darren asked. After Richard left, I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my blue dress. "We should return to the reception," I said. "It's your wedding day, and those people are waiting to celebrate with you." "Mom, wait," Eleanor said, reaching for my hand. "We can't just go back out there and pretend everything's fine. I need to fix this." "How?" I asked simply. Eleanor looked at Darren, who nodded encouragingly. "First, by having you move to the head table where you belong. We'll rearrange the seating immediately." "And say what to your guests? Sorry for the disruption. We just realized we seated the mother of the bride and financial sponsor of this entire event in the back row by mistake?" Eleanor flinched at my uncharacteristic sarcasm. "I'll tell them the truth, that there was a misunderstanding, and you should have been at the head table all along." I shook my head slowly. "The seating is a symptom, Eleanor, not the actual problem. Moving me now won't change the fact that for months you've allowed me to be pushed aside. You've allowed me to pour my savings into a wedding where I was treated like an inconvenient relative rather than your mother." "Then what can I do?" she asked, a note of desperation entering her voice. "Tell me how to make this right." For the first time in our conversation, I truly looked at my daughter. Not the bride in an expensive gown, not the polished young woman who had adapted so seamlessly to the Blackwood lifestyle, but the child I had raised. Behind the perfect makeup and styled hair, I could still see traces of the little girl who had once proudly presented me with a macaroni necklace for Mother's Day, declaring it more beautiful than real jewelry because it's made of love. "You can start," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "by remembering who you are and where you come from. The Eleanor I raised would never have allowed anyone to be treated the way I've been treated today, let alone her own mother." Darren cleared his throat. "I think we should make an announcement before the cake cutting. Set the record straight about who contributed what to this wedding." Eleanor looked uncertain. "Won't that embarrass my mom even more? Drawing attention to the money?" "What would embarrass me," I clarified, "is continuing to sit silently while your mother-in-law takes credit for my financial sacrifice. What would embarrass me is watching my daughter be ashamed of her background." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I've never been ashamed of you, Mom. Never. I've been intimidated by the Blackwoods, by their confidence and connections. I wanted so badly to fit in with them, to feel like I belonged in Darren's world." "You belong in any world you choose," I said firmly, "but not by erasing the one that shaped you." She nodded, wiping carefully at her eyes to preserve her makeup. Then, with new resolve, she stood and straightened her shoulders. "We're going to fix this. Now." The three of us returned to the reception, where the band was still playing and guests were finishing their meals. Eleanor whispered something to the band leader, who nodded and signaled to his musicians. The music faded, and conversations throughout the room quieted in response. Eleanor took the microphone, her hand visibly trembling. Darren stood supportively at her side, while I remained a few steps behind, uncertain of what was to come. "Everyone, if I could have your attention for a moment," she began. "Before we move on to the cake cutting, there's something important I need to address." She paused, scanning the sea of curious faces. "Earlier this evening, there was a misunderstanding about the contributions that made this beautiful wedding possible. I want to set the record straight." She turned slightly, extending her hand toward me. Hesitantly, I stepped forward to join her. "This is my mother, Margaret Harrington. Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger. What many of you don't know is that she is the person who made today possible. Not just by raising me as a single mother after my father died, but by financially providing for this entire wedding. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw Patricia and Richard shifting uncomfortably at a nearby table. Every flower arrangement, every piece of music, every bite of food you've enjoyed tonight was paid for by my mother, who worked extra shifts and used the insurance money my father left to give me this day. Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. And due to a series of miscommunications that were entirely my fault, she has not received the recognition or respect she deserves. She turned to face me directly now, tears spilling down her cheeks despite her efforts to contain them. Mom, I am so sorry. Sorry that I let this happen. Sorry that I didn't stand up for you. Sorry that I've spent months trying so hard to impress people I barely know while taking for granted the one person who has always been there for me. The room had gone completely silent. Every eye was on us as Eleanor reached for my hands. I've been seated at the back of my own daughter's wedding, I said quietly. But in the silence, my words carried. I've watched another woman take credit for my financial sacrifice. I've been treated like an afterthought in the most important day of the child I raised alone. Eleanor nodded, accepting each statement without defense. And that ends now, she said, turning back to the crowd. I'm asking you all to bear with us for a brief rearrangement. My mother will be joining us at the head table where she belongs, and then we'll continue with our celebration, this time with honesty and proper appreciation for everyone's contributions. As staff hurried to add a place setting at the head table, I realized I was witnessing my daughter's first real act of courage in her married life. Not the carefully calculated social navigation she had been practicing for months, but genuine moral courage. Standing up for what was right, even when it meant acknowledging her own mistakes. It was a small step, but as she led me to my rightful place beside her, I felt a flicker of hope that perhaps the Eleanor I had raised was still there after all. The rearrangement at the head table created a visible shift in the evening's dynamics. Patricia Blackwood's smile remained fixed in place, but the warmth had drained from it entirely. Richard made polite conversation, carefully avoiding any mention of the wedding's financing. Darren's sister Iris kept checking her phone, as if suddenly finding the celebration unbearably tedious. Only Darren himself seemed genuinely at ease, occasionally squeezing Eleanor's hand supportively, or leaning over to ask if I needed anything. The cake cutting proceeded with forced normalcy. Flashbulbs popped as Eleanor and Darren fed each other small bites of the 5-tier masterpiece I had commissioned from Bellini's Bakery, another $3,200 expense that had somehow been attributed to Patricia's exquisite taste earlier in the evening. As slices were distributed to the guests, Eleanor made a point of publicly thanking me for the incredible cake from Mom's favorite bakery, a small but meaningful acknowledgement. When the music resumed and the dance floor filled once more, I found myself approached by various guests who had suddenly discovered I existed. "Margaret, what a lovely wedding," gushed a woman in an emerald gown who hadn't given me a second glance during the cocktail hour. "Eleanor is just a treasure. You must be so proud." "I've always been proud of her," I replied simply. "And this venue, absolute perfection. You have remarkable taste." I nodded, accepting the compliment that would have gone to Patricia had Eleanor not made her announcement. The interactions felt hollow. People who had been perfectly content to ignore me hours earlier were now falling over themselves to acknowledge my contribution. Their sudden attention was almost more insulting than their previous indifference. As the evening progressed, I noticed Eleanor making deliberate efforts to include me. She pulled me onto the dance floor for a spontaneous mother-daughter dance. She brought over old college friends I hadn't seen in years for proper introductions. She even arranged for the photographer to take several portraits of just the two of us in the venue's rose garden. Each gesture was appreciated, but I couldn't help feeling they were compensatory rather than natural, the frantic course correction of a daughter who had suddenly realized how far she had drifted. Around 10 o'clock, as some of the older guests began to depart, Patricia approached our table. Her composure had been fully restored, though there was a new brittleness to her smile. "Margaret, could we speak privately for a moment?" she asked. I excused myself and followed her to a quiet corner, near the terrace doors. Night had fallen, and through the glass I could see the garden lighting illuminating pathways between meticulously trimmed hedges. "I feel I owe you an apology," Patricia began, her voice measured. "Had I known the extent of your financial contribution, things would have been handled differently." I studied her carefully. Her apology hinged entirely on the money, not on the fundamental disrespect she had shown me from the beginning. "It shouldn't have mattered whether I contributed $5 or $50,000, I replied. "I'm Eleanor's mother. That alone should have warranted basic courtesy." Patricia's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, that goes without saying." And yet it needed to be said. She sighed, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her silk dress. "Margaret, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. My only concern has ever been ensuring Darren and Eleanor have the best possible start to their marriage. Perhaps in my enthusiasm I overstepped in certain areas." "Perhaps," I echoed, not making it easier for her. "What matters now is moving forward. We're family now, after all." She attempted a warmer smile. "The children will need both of us, especially when grandchildren come along. It would be a shame to let this misunderstanding cast a shadow over our future relationship." I recognized the olive branch for what it was. Not genuine remorse, but a practical woman's attempt to smooth over an uncomfortable situation. Patricia Blackwood was not accustomed to being embarrassed publicly, and she was eager to reestablish equilibrium as quickly as possible. The wedding was nearly over, and she was already strategizing for future family dynamics. "You're right that Eleanor and Darren will need both of us," I acknowledged. "And I have no intention of making things difficult for them. But moving forward requires honesty, Patricia. I won't pretend that what happened today was a simple misunderstanding or a minor oversight." "What would you have me do?" she asked, an edge creeping into her voice. "I've apologized. I've acknowledged your contribution. The seating has been corrected. I'm not asking you to do anything," I said. "I'm simply letting you know that while I'll be cordial for the children's sake, I won't forget how easily you dismissed me, and I certainly won't allow it to happen again." Patricia regarded me with new interest, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "No, I don't suppose I am." I turned to rejoin the reception, then paused. "Just out of curiosity, Patricia, what exactly did you contribute to this wedding, financially speaking?" She blinked, caught off guard by the directness of my question. "Well, we hosted the rehearsal dinner at the club, and the bridal shower, of course, the wedding invitations. Eleanor's veil was a gift from us, and naturally we'll be covering their honeymoon in Santorini." I nodded. The rehearsal dinner had been a modest affair for 20 people. The bridal shower had been held at the Blackwoods' home with catering from their regular service. The invitations, while elegant, couldn't have cost more than a few $100. Eleanor's veil, while beautiful, was not the considerable expense she was implying. All told, the Blackwoods had likely spent less than $15,000, a fraction of my contribution. "Thank you for clarifying," I said. "I wasn't invited to?" "The bridal shower, by the way." I left her standing there, returning to the head table just as Eleanor was preparing to toss her bouquet. She beamed when she saw me, waving me over with genuine warmth. For a fleeting moment, I glimpsed the daughter I remembered, the one who had always looked at me with uncomplicated love. As the night wound down, guests began to depart in greater numbers. The energy of the reception shifted, becoming more intimate as only close friends and family remained. I watched Eleanor and Darren move among their guests, accepting final congratulations and well wishes. They looked happy, if tired. Despite Everything, the wedding itself, had been beautiful, and I took some comfort in knowing I had fulfilled Thomas's wish to give our daughter a day to remember. David approached, offering me a fresh glass of champagne. "Quite an evening," he remarked, settling into the chair beside me. "That's one way of putting it," I agreed, accepting the drink gratefully. "You stood up for yourself," he said, pride evident in his voice. "I don't think I've ever seen you do that before, Maggie." I considered his observation. My brother was right. I had spent a lifetime accommodating others, finding it easier to step back than to assert myself. Even in raising Eleanor alone, I had focused entirely on her needs, rarely acknowledging my own. Perhaps that was part of the problem. I had taught my daughter by example that my feelings were secondary, expendable. "It's strange," I said slowly. "I didn't plan any of it. But sitting in that back row, watching everything I'd paid for, everything I'd sacrificed for, it was like something just broke loose inside me." "About time," David replied. "Thomas would have been proud. He always said you were stronger than you knew." The mention of my late husband brought an unexpected lump to my throat. I wish he could have seen her today. "He would have been up there, making a scene much earlier than you did," David chuckled. "Thomas never did have your patience." We fell silent, watching as the band played what they announced would be their final number. Darren led Eleanor onto the dance floor for one last dance as husband and wife before they departed for their hotel. They moved together with the easy synchronicity of two people genuinely in tune with each other. Whatever my feelings about the Blackwoods, I couldn't deny that Darren seemed to truly love my daughter. As the music drew to a close, Eleanor broke away from Darren and made her way directly to where I sat with David. "Mom," she said, slightly breathless. "Darren and I are about to leave, but I wanted to talk to you first. Alone, if that's okay." David squeezed my shoulder as he stood to give us privacy. "I'll be by the bar when you're ready to go," he told me. Eleanor took his vacated seat, gathering her voluminous skirts around her. Up close, I could see the exhaustion behind her eyes, the strain of maintaining her composure through what had become a far more emotionally complex day than she had anticipated. "I don't even know where to begin," she said quietly, "except to say again how sorry I am, not just for today, but for the past year, for letting things get so far off track." "It's your wedding day," I said. "You don't need to spend it apologizing." "Yes, I do." She reached for my hand. "Because I need you to know that I understand what happened now. I got so caught up in trying to be what I thought Darren's family wanted that I lost sight of who I actually am. Who we are." The sincerity in her voice touched me. "The Blackwoods can be overwhelming," I acknowledged. "It's not entirely your fault." "It is, though. I should have been honest from the beginning, with them about your contribution, with you about the planning decisions, with myself about what I was doing." She twisted her new wedding ring nervously. "I kept telling myself it was just easier this way, that I was protecting everyone's feelings. But really, I was being a coward." I squeezed her hand. "You're not a coward, Eleanor. You're just young and trying to navigate a complicated situation. That's no excuse for how I treated you." She looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "When I saw you sitting in the back row today, something felt wrong, but I pushed the feeling away. I told myself it was too late to change things, that making a fuss would only create drama. I chose the easy path instead of the right one." Again. Her words confirmed what I had suspected, that she had noticed my inappropriate seating, but had chosen to accept it rather than challenge the Blackwoods' decision. The admission hurt, but her honesty was also a relief after months of pretense. "What happens now?" I asked. Eleanor squared her shoulders, suddenly looking more like the daughter I had raised and less like the polished society bride she had become. "Now I start making better choices. beginning with our brunch tomorrow. The morning after the wedding dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the curtains of my hotel room. I had barely slept, my mind replaying the events of the previous day in an endless loop. The hurt of being seated in the back row. The shock of Patricia's speech taking credit for my contributions. The liberating clarity of finally speaking my truth. Eleanor's tearful apology. I dressed carefully in a sage green pantsuit I had packed for the farewell brunch, scheduled for 11 a.m. at the Blackwoods Country Club. This event was to be their exclusive domain, the one part of the wedding festivities they were undisputedly hosting and financing. Under normal circumstances, I would have approached the brunch with diplomatic politeness, careful not to overstep in their territory. But after yesterday, the old rules no longer applied. As I fastened my pearl earrings, the same ones I had worn to marry Thomas 35 years earlier, my phone chimed with a message from Eleanor. Car service picking you up at 10:15. Meeting. You at the club entrance. Love you, Mom. The simple, love you, warmed me more than it should have. Those words had become rare in recent months, replaced by hurried goodbyes and perfunctory check-ins. Perhaps yesterday's confrontation had shaken something loose for both of us. The car arrived precisely on time, a sleek black sedan rather than the standard taxi I had expected. The driver held the door with practiced courtesy. Mrs. Harrington? I'm to take you to Oak Ridge Country Club. 20 minutes later, we pulled through wrought iron gates and up a winding drive lined with century-old oak trees. The country club was everything one would expect. Manicured lawns, colonial architecture, staff in crisp uniforms moving with practiced efficiency. It exuded old money and established privilege, the kind of place where membership was inherited, rather than purchased. True to her word, Eleanor was waiting at the entrance, still radiant despite what must have been minimal sleep. She had changed from blushing bride to polished newlywed in a cream-colored dress that looked effortlessly elegant. When she spotted me, her face lit up with a genuine smile, the kind I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I cared to admit. Mom. She embraced me warmly, then stepped back to examine me. You look beautiful. That color is perfect on you. Thank you, dear. You look lovely as well. I glanced around the imposing entrance. Quite a place. The Blackwoods have been members for generations, she said, then winced slightly at how that sounded. I mean, it's nice, but honestly, a bit stuffy for my taste. This small admission, that perhaps the Blackwood lifestyle wasn't everything she had been pretending it was, felt significant. Darren's talking with his parents inside, she continued, linking her arm through mine. I wanted to speak with you, privately before we join everyone. She led me to a small garden alcove just off the main entrance, where a stone bench sat beneath a flowering arbor. Once seated, she turned to face me, her expression serious. I made some changes to the brunch arrangements this morning, she began. Nothing dramatic, but important adjustments. What kind of adjustments? I asked, curious. First, I rearranged the seating chart. You're at the main table with Darren and me, directly across from his parents. She held up a hand before I could respond. And before you worry that I'm creating more tension, I already spoke with Patricia. She understands this is non-negotiable. I raised an eyebrow, trying to imagine that conversation. And she agreed? She did. Eleanor smiled ruefully. Not enthusiastically, but she agreed. Darren backed me up. That's progress, I acknowledged. There's more. Eleanor squared her shoulders. I also changed the program to include a proper acknowledgement of your contribution to the wedding. I'll be making a toast thanking you specifically. I shook my head. Eleanor, that's not necessary. Yesterday wasn't about public recognition or gratitude. It was about basic respect. I know that, but it's important to me. Her eyes were determined. Yesterday made me realize how I've been allowing others to reshape our family narrative. How I've been complicit in minimizing your role in my life. That stops now." The fierceness in her voice reminded me of Thomas. He had been the more openly protective parent, quick to defend our family against any slight. Eleanor had inherited his sense of justice, though it had been dormant recently. "There's something else you should know," she continued. "Darren and I had a long talk last night about everything, the wedding, his parents, our future. He was—" She paused, searching for the right words. "He was deeply upset by how you were treated. He said it made him see his parents in a different light." This surprised me. Darren had always struck me as devoted to his family, accepting their values and perspectives without question. "How so?" "He said he's always known they can be elitist, but he thought it was mostly harmless social posturing. Seeing how they systematically sidelined you despite your generosity made him question a lot of things." Eleanor looked down at her wedding ring. "He actually apologized for not noticing sooner, for not intervening." "That couldn't have been an easy conversation," I observed. "No, but it was necessary, and ultimately good." She met my eyes again. "We agreed that we need to establish clearer boundaries with his parents from the start. That we can't allow either of our families to disrespect the other." I nodded, cautiously optimistic about this new resolve. Boundaries are healthy, though easier discussed than implemented, especially with established family dynamics. "I know. That's why today is so important." She stood, offering me her hand. "Ready to put our new boundaries to the test?" The brunch was set up in a sunlit private dining room overlooking the golf course. Round tables adorned with fresh flowers filled the space, each place setting marked with elegant calligraphy. About 60 guests had attended, mostly out-of-town relatives and the wedding party, as is customary for such events. As promised, the main table was arranged with Eleanor and Darren at the center, me to Eleanor's right, and the Blackwoods across from us. Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly when she saw us enter together, but she maintained her composure. "Margaret, how lovely to see you," she said, her voice honey-sweet. "I trust you slept well." "Quite well, thank you," I lied politely. Richard nodded in greeting, seeming eager to avoid any reprise of yesterday's tension. Darren stood as we approached, kissing Eleanor's cheek before turning to me. "Margaret, good morning." He surprised me by leaning in to kiss my cheek as well, a gesture he had never made before. "I'm glad you're here." As we took our seats, I noticed subtle reactions from other guests. Raised eyebrows, exchanged glances. Clearly, word of yesterday's seating drama had circulated. I could almost hear the whispered conversations. "Did you see how they put her in the back row? I heard she paid for the whole wedding." The Blackwoods tried to pretend she didn't exist. Under normal circumstances, such gossip would have mortified me. Today, I found I didn't care. Let them talk. Let them know exactly what had happened. The brunch progressed with practiced elegance. Mimosas poured, appetizers served, pleasant conversation maintained. On the surface, one might never guess the emotional currents running beneath. Patricia spoke mostly to the guests on her side of the table, while Richard made stilted but polite conversation with me about the weather and the success of the wedding. When the main course was cleared, Eleanor tapped her glass lightly with a spoon. The room quieted as she stood, radiating a calm confidence that made my heart swell with pride. "Darren and I want to thank you all for extending your celebration with us to this morning," she began. "Your presence has made our wedding weekend truly special." Standard opening pleasantries dispensed with, she continued, her voice growing more personal. "As many of you know, I lost my father when I was 14. He isn't here physically, but his love and lessons have shaped every part of who I am." I felt tears threatening at the mention of Thomas. Eleanor so rarely spoke of him publicly. What some of you may not know is that when Dad died, he left instructions for Mom about my future wedding day. Eleanor's gaze found mine. He asked her to make sure that whenever I got married, I would have the day of my dreams, regardless of cost or practicality. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, undoubtedly sensing where this was heading. Yesterday, my mother fulfilled that promise, beyond anything Dad could have imagined. Not just financially, though she did provide the majority of the funding for our beautiful celebration, but in every meaningful way. Eleanor's voice wavered slightly. She stepped back when I pushed her aside. She remained gracious when she wasn't treated with the respect she deserved. She put my happiness above her own dignity, because that's what she's always done. The room had gone completely still. Even the staff had paused in their duties, caught by the raw emotion in Eleanor's words. "Mom," she said, looking directly at me now, "I didn't appreciate the magnitude of your sacrifice until yesterday. I didn't see how I was allowing others to diminish your role in my life. For that, I am deeply sorry." I blinked rapidly, determined not to break down in front of the Blackwoods and their country club friends. "As Darren and I begin our married life," Eleanor continued, raising her glass, "we carry with us the example of unconditional love that you have provided. We can only hope to build a relationship half as resilient, half as generous as the one you and Dad shared." She turned slightly to include the entire table in her gaze. "So I'd like to propose a toast. To my mother, Margaret Harrington. Thank you for everything you have given me, visible and invisible. I promise to be more worthy of it going forward." "To Margaret," Darren echoed firmly, raising his glass. The room responded in kind, a chorus of "To Margaret" rippling outward from our table. I raised my own glass in acknowledgement, meeting Eleanor's eyes with a silent thank you. Across the table, Patricia and Richard participated in the toast with fixed smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They had been outmaneuvered, and they knew it. Eleanor had reclaimed her narrative in the most public way possible, leaving them no choice but to acquiesce or appear petty. As the brunch continued, I noticed a subtle but definite shift. Guests who had previously gravitated exclusively toward the Blackwoods now made a point of stopping by to speak with me. Stories were shared about Eleanor's childhood, about Thomas, about our family traditions. It was as if Eleanor's speech had granted permission for our history to exist alongside the glittering Blackwood legacy rather than being overshadowed by it. More significantly, I observed a new confidence in my daughter's interactions. She no longer glanced anxiously at Patricia, after each comment seeking approval. She spoke about our modest family holidays with the same easy pride as she discussed the honeymoon plans the Blackwoods had arranged. She had found her balance again, or perhaps was discovering it for the first time as an adult. By the time dessert was served, one thing had become abundantly clear. Yesterday's confrontation had not been a temporary disruption quickly smoothed over. It had been the beginning of a fundamental realignment, one that would reshape all our relationships going forward. In the weeks following the wedding, a new equilibrium began to establish itself. Eleanor and Darren returned from their honeymoon, in Santorini, bronzed and relaxed, bearing small gifts and stories of cliffside villages and crystalline waters. They invited me to dinner at their new apartment, a spacious two-bedroom in a converted industrial building downtown, far from the manicured suburb where the Blackwoods lived and where I had assumed they would settle. We decided we wanted our own space, Eleanor explained as she showed me around. Something that reflects both of us, not just one family's expectations. The apartment was a pleasing blend of styles: modern furniture mixed with vintage pieces, abstract art alongside traditional landscapes. Nothing like the formal Blackwood aesthetic I had glimpsed at Richard and Patricia's home, nor a replica of my own modest suburban house. It was entirely their own, and I felt a quiet pride in their independence. Over dinner, a paella Darren had learned to make during a cooking class in Spain years earlier, the conversation flowed more naturally than it had in months. Eleanor spoke about her plans to return to work at the architectural firm where she'd been before the wedding. Darren shared news about a community development project his bank was financing in an underserved neighborhood. How are things with the Blackwoods? I finally asked, the question I'd been carefully avoiding all evening. Eleanor and Darren exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them. We're maintaining appropriate distance, Darren said diplomatically. Sunday dinners twice. A month, not weekly as my mother had planned. Phone calls when necessary, not daily check-ins. They're adjusting, Eleanor added, though her tone suggested the adjustment wasn't entirely smooth. Patricia called 3 times during our honeymoon, despite Darren telling her we wanted privacy, and she had a decorator drop by last week with suggestions for the apartment, which we politely declined, Darren finished. We're learning that boundaries need regular reinforcement. I nodded, understanding all too well. And how are they with me? I haven't heard from either of them since the brunch. Another exchanged glance between the newlyweds. They're civil, Eleanor said carefully. Patricia asked if you'd be at our housewarming next month. I told her of course you would. They're trying, Darren added. In their way. My father actually mentioned enjoying his conversation with you at the brunch. I raised an eyebrow, recalling our stilted exchange about golf courses and weather patterns. Did he? Well, he said you were more knowledgeable about finance than he expected, Darren admitted with a wry smile. For my father, that's practically effusive praise. We laughed, and I felt a tension I hadn't realized I was carrying begin to release. The wedding confrontation had not destroyed their relationship with the Blackwoods, nor had it been brushed aside in favor of artificial harmony. They were navigating a middle path, maintaining family ties while establishing their independence. The evening drew to a close. Eleanor walked me to my car. The night air had a crisp edge to it, hinting at the approaching autumn. It means a lot that you came tonight, she said, hugging me before I got in. I know things are still complicated. Family always is, I replied. But we're finding our way, she nodded, then hesitated, seemingly on the verge of saying something more. Mom, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. What is it, dear? Would you consider coming with me to look at office spaces next week? I'm thinking of starting my own architectural practice, focusing on affordable housing design. I'd value your perspective on the business side. The request caught me by surprise. Eleanor had never sought my professional input before, seeming to forget that before I was a widow and a mother, I had been a bookkeeper with a head for numbers and practical solutions. I'd be honored, I said, feeling a new warmth bloom between us. As the autumn progressed, these small shifts multiplied. Eleanor began calling more regularly, not out of obligation, but with genuine questions, or simply to share parts of her day. She and Darren alternated holiday plans between the Blackwoods and me, refusing to be pulled entirely into either family's orbit. When Patricia attempted to plan their first Thanksgiving as a married couple, at the country club naturally, they gently but firmly declined, opting instead to host a small gathering in their apartment with both families invited. Are you sure about this? I asked when Eleanor called to discuss the menu. Thanksgiving with both families might be challenging. Probably, she agreed with a laugh. But it's important to Darren and me that we establish our own traditions, not just fall into one family's patterns. If they can't handle sharing a meal peacefully, that's their problem. The transformation in my daughter continued to unfold in other ways. She spoke more openly about her father, sharing memories she had guarded closely for years. She retrieved boxes of childhood mementos from my attic, displaying select pieces in her new home. When one of Darren's cousins became engaged, she offered practical advice about budgeting for the wedding rather than deferring to Patricia's lavish recommendations. Most telling was how she began to reconcile the different facets of her identity. The Eleanor who had grown up in our modest neighborhood and the Eleanor who had adapted to the Blackwoods' world of privilege were no longer separate personas at war with each other. She moved with increasing comfort between different social contexts, no longer apologizing for where she came from, nor trying to conceal her new ambitions. One October afternoon, I accompanied Eleanor to view potential office spaces for her fledgling architectural practice. We had toured 3 uninspiring locations when our real estate agent mentioned one final option: a corner unit in a historic building downtown, recently renovated but still priced below market rate due to the owner's desire to attract creative businesses. The moment we walked in, I knew this was the one. Tall windows flooded the space with natural light. Original hardwood floors gleamed beneath our feet. Exposed brick walls provided character while the updated infrastructure ensured modern functionality. "It's perfect," Eleanor breathed, already, moving through the space with an architect's vision, pointing out where drafting tables could go, where client meetings would take place. As she discussed lease terms with the agent, I wandered to the windows, gazing out at the city below. From this vantage point, one could see both the historic courthouse where my father had worked as a clerk for 40 years and the gleaming financial district where Darren's bank occupied the 23rd floor of a glass tower. Old and new, modest, and grand, all part of the same landscape. "What do you think, Mom?" Eleanor asked, joining me at the window. "Can I make this work?" I recognized that she wasn't just asking about the physical space or even the business plan we had been developing. She was asking a deeper question about her ability to forge her own path between the working-class pragmatism she'd grown up with and the ambitious certainty the Blackwoods embodied. "Absolutely," I said with complete conviction. "In fact, I'd like to make you an offer." Eleanor tilted her head curiously. "What kind of offer?" "An investment." I turned to face her fully. "I still have some of your father's insurance money set aside. Instead of holding it for some future emergency, I'd like to invest it in your business as startup capital." Her eyes widened. "Mom, that's your security. Dad wanted you to have that for your future." I smiled, thinking of Thomas and how proud he would be of the woman our daughter had become. "Your father believed in investing in things that matter. Nothing would matter more to him than helping you build something meaningful." "I don't know what to say," she whispered, genuine emotion clouding her voice. "Say you'll accept it as a business investment, not a gift," I said firmly. "With proper paperwork, reasonable terms, and no strings attached. I'll be a silent partner with no control over creative decisions." Eleanor laughed through tears that had begun to form. "You've given this some thought." "I have," I admitted. "Ever since you mentioned starting your own practice. The wedding showed me that I need to be more direct about my contributions and expectations. No more silent sacrifices or assumed understandings." She nodded slowly. "That's fair. More than fair." She looked around the sunlit space one more time, then back to me with newfound resolution. "Let's do it. Partners." We shook hands formally, then dissolved into laughter at the unnecessary seriousness of the gesture. The real estate agent, witnessing our exchange, smiled as she prepared the paperwork to secure the space. As we left the building, Eleanor linked her arm through mine, a gesture that had once been habitual between us but had grown rare in recent years. "You know Patricia's going to have opinions about this," she said, her tone light but knowing. "About your office, your business, or your business partner?" I asked dryly. "All of the above." Eleanor's smile held a confidence that warmed me to see. "But her opinions are just that. Opinions. Not facts, not commands. Just one perspective. Among many." This, I realized, was the true transformation unfolding before me. Not Eleanor choosing my influence over the Blackwoods, but Eleanor learning to evaluate all influences against her own inner compass. She was becoming not what either family wanted her to be, but what she herself needed to become. As we reached my car, Eleanor pulled me into a spontaneous hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for the investment, but for not giving up on me even when I was lost." "I could never give up on you," I replied simply. "You're my daughter." And in those 4 words lay the truth that had been obscured by wedding seating charts and social hierarchies, by insecurities and aspirations. No matter where life took her, no matter what name she carried or circles she moved in, Eleanor would always be my daughter. And I would always be her mother, not placed in the back row of her life, but holding an essential, irreplaceable position that no one, not even the formidable Blackwoods, could ever truly diminish. I am Judith Blackwood, Patricia's sister, and I have watched this family drama unfold with a perspective none of the principal players possess. Living in the shadow of my perfect sister has given me unique insight into the Blackwood family dynamics and what Margaret Harrington has been up against all along. When Patricia called me the night after the wedding reception, her voice tight, with controlled fury, I knew something significant had occurred. My sister rarely loses her composure. Public appearances are far too important to her. But that evening, her carefully constructed facade was cracking. "Can you believe the nerve?" she hissed into the phone. "Making a scene at Eleanor's wedding. Embarrassing us in front of everyone. Acting as if paying for the wedding entitles her to special treatment." I listened patiently as she recounted the confrontation, her version casting Margaret as an attention-seeking, socially inept woman who had disrupted a beautiful celebration out of petty jealousy. I had met Margaret only briefly during the rehearsal. Dinner, finding her to be quiet and unassuming. Hardly the dramatic instigator Patricia was describing. "Did you really seat her in the back row?" I asked when she paused for breath. "That's hardly the point, Judith," Patricia snapped. "The seating chart was complex. We had to consider many factors, such as making sure Eleanor's mother couldn't see her daughter get married." I couldn't resist the pointed question. Patricia's silence spoke volumes. Finally, she sighed. "You know how Richard feels about maintaining certain standards. Margaret doesn't exactly fit with the image we've cultivated. And she was being properly acknowledged in other ways. By allowing her to pay for everything, while you took the credit?" The words slipped out before I could censor them. "I'm not having this conversation if you're going to take her side," Patricia said coldly. "I expected more loyalty from you of all people." The irony of Patricia invoking family loyalty wasn't lost on me. Throughout our lives, loyalty in the Blackwood family has flowed in one direction, toward protecting the family's reputation and social standing above all else, including basic decency. I was 13 when I first recognized this pattern. Patricia, 5 years older and already a perfect reflection of our parents' ambitions, had been accepted to an Ivy League college. At her celebratory dinner, attended by our parents' most important social connections, I made the mistake of mentioning that Patricia's boyfriend had helped write her application essay. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Later that night, our father delivered a lecture I still remember verbatim. "Blackwoods present a united front to the world. Whatever happens within the family stays within the family." The message was clear. Truth was secondary to appearances. Loyalty meant complicity in maintaining our carefully curated image, regardless of reality. As adults, Patricia perfected this philosophy. She married Richard, whose banking fortune complemented our old family name. They produced 2 children, Darren and Iris, who were groomed from birth to continue the Blackwood legacy. Their home in Lakeside Heights, their membership at Oak Ridge Country Club, their positions on prestigious boards, all were selected to reinforce their standing in a social hierarchy they valued above all else. I chose a different path, marrying a professor and moving to a university town 3 hours away. Our more modest lifestyle and my tendency to speak uncomfortable truths have made me something of a family outlier. I am invited to important events but rarely consulted on family matters. Patricia maintains our relationship with dutiful phone calls and occasional visits, always with an undercurrent of disappointment that I've failed to uphold the Blackwood standard. When Darren announced his engagement to Eleanor, I witnessed Patricia's masterful recalibration. Initially dismayed that her son had chosen someone from a limited background, her words, not mine, she quickly shifted to a strategy of benevolent absorption. Eleanor wouldn't be rejected. She would be remade. She has potential, Patricia told me over lunch shortly after the engagement. Good bone structure, excellent education, just needs some polish. With proper guidance, most people would never guess where she came from. Heaven forbid anyone should know Darren married someone whose mother works for a living, I remarked. Patricia ignored the jab, already planning how to integrate Eleanor into their world while minimizing inconvenient elements of her past, particularly Margaret. I attended the wedding weekend with a sense of foreboding. At the rehearsal dinner, I observed Margaret's isolation. Placed at a peripheral table, rarely addressed directly, her contributions to conversations politely acknowledged, then swiftly redirected. She accepted this treatment with quiet dignity, which only deepened my discomfort. She was being erased in plain sight, and no one, not even her daughter, seemed to notice or object. The day after Patricia's phone call about the reception confrontation, I decided to reach out to Margaret directly. We had no relationship to speak of. Patricia had ensured our social circles remained distinct. But something about the situation demanded intervention. If not from family, then from whom? I found her contact information in the wedding program and called under the pretense of thanking her for the beautiful celebration. She seemed surprised to hear from me but graciously accepted my compliments. I understand there was some confusion about the financial arrangements, I said carefully. Pause, then. Yes, that's one way to describe it. I want you to know, I continued, that not all Blackwoods share the same perspectives on social matters. Her laugh was soft but not unkind. You mean not all Blackwoods believe the mother of the bride belongs in the back row? Precisely. I appreciated her directness. Patricia has very specific ideas about how things should appear. Reality is often secondary. I've noticed, Margaret said dryly. We spoke for nearly an hour, finding unexpected common ground. She shared her concerns about Eleanor's transformation under Patricia's influence. I offered insights into the Blackwood family patterns that might help her navigate the relationship going forward. By the call's end, I felt I'd found an ally in the complicated family dynamic unfolding around Darren and Eleanor. Over the following months, Margaret and I developed a cautious friendship. We met occasionally for coffee when I visited the city. Our conversations ranging from family matters to books to current events. I found her to be thoughtful and perceptive, with a quiet strength that Patricia had entirely misjudged. Far from the social climber or desperate widow my sister had portrayed, Margaret was a woman of substance who asked only for the respect she deserved. When Eleanor launched her architectural practice focusing on affordable housing, Patricia was, predictably, dismayed. She had offers from prestigious firms, she lamented during one of our phone calls. Why waste her talent on low-income projects when she could be designing for people who can afford quality? I attended the open house for Eleanor's new office, observing the dynamic between mother and daughter with interest. The space itself was beautiful. Historic bones with modern functionality, exactly the balance Eleanor was striking in her own life. Margaret moved through the gathering with quiet pride, introducing herself as Eleanor's mother and business partner to clients and colleagues. What struck me most was the change in Eleanor herself. The tentative, eager-to-please young woman I had met at family gatherings had been replaced by someone more assured, more authentic. She navigated conversations with Margaret's friends, Darren's, business associates, and her own professional contacts with equal comfort, no longer shifting her persona to match her audience. During a quiet moment, I found myself standing beside Margaret as we watched Eleanor across the room, animatedly explaining a design concept to a community development officer. She seems to have found her center, I observed. Margaret nodded, her expression a mixture of pride and wistfulness. It was a bumpy journey, but yes, I think she has. How are things with Patricia these days? I couldn't help asking. Cordial, Margaret replied carefully. We've reached a detente of sorts. She invites me to appropriate family functions. I attend with reasonable frequency. She makes suggestions about Eleanor's business. I listen politely, and Eleanor does what she thinks best. That sounds manageable. It is. She sipped her wine thoughtfully. I've realized something important about your sister, Judith. Patricia isn't evil or even particularly malicious. She simply can't imagine a world where her way isn't objectively superior. It makes her blind to other perspectives, other values. The insight struck me as remarkably generous, given how Patricia had treated her. That's very understanding of you? Margaret smiled slightly. Understanding doesn't mean accepting poor treatment. I've become much more direct about my expectations and boundaries. But it helps to recognize that her behavior comes from a lifetime of privilege and reinforcement, not personal animosity. I watched Patricia across the room, maintaining a careful smile as Eleanor introduced her to a former classmate who had become a community organizer. My sister was trying, in her limited way, to adapt to a reality that didn't conform to her expectations. The effort was visible in her rigid posture and slightly too bright social manner. The Thanksgiving dinner was a turning point, Margaret continued. Eleanor insisted on hosting both families in their apartment. Patricia was horrified at first. Holiday celebrations at the country club are practically a Blackwood sacrament, but Eleanor stood firm. I had missed that gathering, traveling with my husband to visit his family, but had heard Patricia's sanitized version of events. How did it go? About as awkwardly as you'd expect, Margaret admitted. But important boundaries were established. Eleanor made it clear that as a married couple, she and Darren would be creating their own traditions, not simply adopting either family's practices wholesale. And Patricia accepted this? She didn't have much choice. Richard surprisingly backed Eleanor and Darren's decision, and Patricia wouldn't contradict him publicly. Margaret's eyes crinkled with amusement. I think he found it refreshing to eat turkey in a regular apartment, rather than the formal dining room at Oak Ridge for the 43rd consecutive year. This didn't surprise me. Despite his outward conformity to Blackwood expectations, Richard had occasionally revealed hints of restlessness with Patricia's rigid social rules. He was still very much a product of his upbringing, but perhaps less invested in maintaining appearances at all costs. As the open house wound down, I observed Eleanor moving between her different worlds with newfound ease. She linked arms with Margaret while discussing business strategy with a bank representative. She welcomed Darren's arrival with genuine warmth, but continued her conversation without deferring to him. She thanked Patricia for the elaborate flower arrangement she had sent, while gently declining her offer to introduce her to more suitable clients. In that moment, I understood what Margaret had already recognized. Eleanor had not chosen between her mother's world and the Blackwoods. She had instead created something entirely her own, drawing strength from her heritage while refusing to be limited by anyone's expectations. Later, as we said our goodbyes, I embraced Margaret with genuine affection. You've raised a remarkable daughter, I told her. She's found her voice. Margaret smiled, her eyes bright with emotion. She always had it. She just needed to remember how to use it. Walking to my car, I couldn't help reflecting on the contrast between the two mothers in Eleanor's life. Patricia, with all her social connections and financial resources, had attempted to remake Eleanor into a proper Blackwood, erasing what didn't fit her vision. Margaret, despite being relegated to the back row, had ultimately given Eleanor something far more valuable, the confidence to define herself on her own terms. The wedding seating arrangement had revealed more than Patricia ever intended about the values that truly matter in building a family legacy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.